Lenin on the State and Revolution, Chapter 2. The State and Revolution, the Experience of 1848 to 51. Part 1. The Eve of the Revolution. The first works of mature Marxism, The Poverty of Philosophy and the Communist Manifesto, appeared just on the eve of the Revolution of 1848. Because of this, in addition to presenting the general principles of Marxism, they reflect to a certain degree the concrete revolutionary situation of the time. Hence, it will be more appropriate perhaps to examine what the authors of these works said about the state immediately before they drew conclusions from the experience of the years 1848 to 51. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx wrote, "The working class, in the course of its development, will substitute for the old bourgeois society an association which will exclude classes and their antagonism, and there will be no more political power properly so called, since political power is precisely the official expression of class antagonism in bourgeois society." It is instructive to compare this general exposition of the idea of the state disappearing after the abolition of classes with the exposition contained in the Communist Manifesto written by Marx and Engels a few months later, to be exact, in November 1847. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we traced the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. We've seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralise all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organised as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. That's from pages 31 and 37 of the 7th German edition. Here we have a formulation of one of the most remarkable and most important ideas of Marxism on the subject of the state, namely the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx and Engels began to call it after the Paris Commune. And then a supremely interesting definition of the state, which is also one of the forgotten words of Marxism. The state, i.e. the proletariat, organised as the ruling class. This definition of the state has never been explained in the prevailing propaganda and agitational literature of the official social democratic parties. More than that, it has been deliberately forgotten, for it is absolutely irreconcilable with reformism, and is a slap in the face of the common opportunist prejudices and Philistine illusions about the peaceful development of democracy. The proletariat needs the state. This is repeated by all the opportunists, social chauvinists and Kautskyites, who assure us that this is what Marx taught. But they forget to add that in the first place, according to Marx, the proletariat needs only a state which is withering away, i.e. a state so constituted that it begins to wither away immediately and cannot but wither away. And secondly, the working people need a state, i.e. the proletariat organised as the ruling class. The state is a special organisation of force. It is an organisation of violence for the suppression of some class. What class must the proletariat suppress? Naturally, only the exploiting class, i.e. the bourgeoisie. The working people need a state only to suppress the resistance of the exploiters. And only the proletariat is in a position to direct this suppression and carry it out. For the proletariat is the only class that is consistently revolutionary, the only class able to unite all the working and exploited people in the struggle against the bourgeoisie in completely displacing it. The exploiting classes need political rule in order to maintain exploitation, i.e. in the selfish interests of an insignificant minority against the vast majority of the people. The exploited classes need political rule in order completely to abolish all exploitation, i.e. in the interests of the vast majority of the people, against the insignificant minority consisting of the modern slave owners, the landlords and the capitalists. The petty bourgeois democrats, those alleged socialists who have replaced class struggle by dreams of class harmony, even pictured the socialist transformation in a dreamy fashion, not as the overthrow of the rule of the exploiting class, but as the peaceful submission of the minority to the majority, which has become aware of its aims. This petty bourgeois utopia which is inseparably connected with the idea of the state being above classes, led in practice to the betrayal of the interests of the toiling classes, as was shown, for example, by the history of the French revolutions of 1848 and 1871, and by the experience of socialist participation in bourgeois cabinets in England, France, Italy, and other countries at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Marx fought all his life against this petty bourgeois socialism, now resurrected in Russia by the Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik parties. He developed his teaching on the class struggle consistently, down to the teaching on political power, on the state. The overthrow of bourgeois rule can be accomplished only by the proletariat, as the particular class whose economic conditions of existence prepare it for this task, and provide it with the possibility and the strength to perform it. While the bourgeoisie breaks up and disintegrates the peasantry and all the petty bourgeois strata, it welds together, unites and organises the proletariat. Only the proletariat, by virtue of the economic role it plays in large-scale production, is capable of being the leader of all the working and exploited masses, whom the bourgeoisie exploits, oppresses and crushes, often not less but more than it does the proletarians, but who are incapable of waging an independent struggle for their emancipation. The teaching of the class struggle, applied by Marx to the question of the state and of the socialist revolution, leads of necessity to the recognition of the political rule of the proletariat, of its dictatorship, i.e. of power undivided with anyone else and relying directly upon the armed force of the masses. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie can be achieved only by transformation of the proletariat into the ruling class, capable of crushing the inevitable and desperate resistance of the bourgeoisie and of organising all the working and exploited masses for the new economic order. The proletariat needs state power, the centralised organisation of force, the organisation of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the enormous mass of the population, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie and semi-proletarians, in the work of organising socialist economy. By educating the Workers' Party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat, which is capable of taking power and of leading the whole people to socialism, of orienting and organising the new order, of being the teacher, the guide, the leader of all the working and exploited people in the task of building up their social life without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie. By contrast, the opportunism which now holds sway trains from among the membership of the Workers' Party representatives of the better paid workers who lose touch with the masses, get along fairly well under capitalism, and sell their birthright for a mess of pottage, i.e. renounce their role as revolutionary leaders of the people against the bourgeoisie. The state, i.e. the proletariat, organises the ruling class. This theory of Marx is inseparably bound up with all he taught on the revolutionary role of the proletariat in history. The culmination of this role is the proletarian dictatorship, the political rule of the proletariat. But if the proletariat needs the state as a special form of organisation of violence against the bourgeoisie, the following conclusion suggests itself. Is it conceivable that such an organisation can be created without first destroying, demolishing the state machine created by the bourgeoisie for itself? The Communist Manifesto leads straight to this conclusion, and it is of this conclusion that Marx speaks when summing up the experience of the revolution of 1848 to 51. Part 2, the revolution summed up. Marx sums up his conclusions from the revolution of 1848 to 51 on the question of the state we are concerned with, in the following argument contained in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. But the revolution is thoroughgoing. It is still journeying through purgatory. It does its work methodically. By December the 2nd, 1851, the day of Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat, it had completed one half of its preparatory work. It is now completing the other half. First, it perfected the parliamentary power in order to be able to overthrow it. Now that it has attained this, it is perfecting the executive power, reducing it to its purest expression, isolating it, setting it up against itself as the sole reproach, in order to concentrate all its forces of destruction against it. When it has done this second half of its preliminary work, Europe will leap from its seat and exultantly exclaim, "Well grubbed, old mole." This executive power, with its enormous bureaucratic and military organisation, with its vast and ingenious state machinery, with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000, This appalling parasitic body, which enmeshes the body of French society and chokes all its pores, sprang up in the days of the absolute monarchy, with the decay of the feudal system which it helped to hasten. The first French Revolution developed centralization, but at the same time, it increased the extent, the attributes, and the number of agents of governmental power. Napoleon completed this state machinery. The legitimist monarchy and the July monarchy added nothing but a greater division of labour. Finally, in its struggle against the revolution, the parliamentary republic found itself compelled to strengthen, along with the repressive measures, the resources and centralisation of governmental power. All revolutions perfected this machine instead of smashing it. The parties that contended in turn for domination regarded the possession of this huge state edifice as the principal spoils of the victor. That's from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, pages 98 to 99, 4th edition, Hamburg, 1907. In this remarkable argument, Marxism takes a tremendous step forward compared with the Communist Manifesto. In the latter, the question of the state is still put in an extremely abstract manner, in the most general terms and expressions. In the above quoted passage, the question is put concretely, and the conclusion is extremely precise, definite, and palpable in practice. All previous revolutions perfected the state machine, but it must be broken up, smashed. This conclusion is the chief and fundamental point in the Marxist teaching on the state. And it is precisely this fundamental point which is not only completely forgotten by the dominant official social democratic parties, but distorted outright, as we shall see later, by the most prominent theoretician of the Second International, K. Kautsky. The Communist Manifesto gives a general summary of history, which compels us to regard the state as the organ of class rule, and leads us to the inevitable conclusion that the proletariat cannot overthrow the bourgeoisie without first conquering political power, without attaining political supremacy, without transforming the state into the proletariat organised as the ruling class. And that this proletariat state will begin to wither away immediately after its victory, because the state is unnecessary and cannot exist in a society in which there are no class contradictions. The question as to how, from the point of view of historical development, the replacement of the bourgeois state by the proletarian state is to take place is not raised here. This is the question Marx raises and answers in 1852. True to his philosophy of dialectical materialism, Marx takes as his basis the historical experience of the great years of revolution, 1848 to 1851. Here, as everywhere, his teaching is a summing up of experience, illuminated by a profound philosophical conception of the world and a rich knowledge of history. The problem of the state is put concretely. How did the bourgeois state, the state machine necessary for the rule of the bourgeoisie, come into being historically? What changes did it undergo? How did it evolve in the course of the bourgeois revolutions and in the face of the independent actions of the oppressed classes? What are the tasks of the proletariat in relation to this state machine? The centralised state power that is peculiar to bourgeois society came into being in the period of the fall of absolutism. Two institutions are most characteristic of this state machine: the bureaucracy and the standing army. In their works, Marx and Engels repeatedly show that it is the bourgeoisie with whom these institutions are connected by thousands of threads. The experience of every worker illustrates this connection in an extremely graphic and impressive manner. From its own bitter experience, the working class learns to recognise this connection. That is why it so easily grasps and so firmly learns the science which shows the inevitability of this connection. A science which the petty bourgeois democrats either ignorantly and flippantly deny, or still more flippantly admit in general, while forgetting to draw the corresponding practical conclusions. The bureaucracy and the standing army are a parasite on the body of bourgeois society, a parasite born of the internal contradictions which rend that society, but a parasite which chokes all its vital pores. The Kautskyite opportunism, now dominating official social democracy, considers the view that the state is a parasitic organism to be the peculiar and exclusive attribute of anarchism. It goes without saying that this distortion of Marxism is of extreme advantage to those Philistines who have reduced socialism to the unheard of disgrace of justifying and embellishing the imperialist war by applying to it the concept of defence of the fatherland. But it is unquestionably a distortion nevertheless. The development, perfecting and strengthening of this bureaucratic and military apparatus proceeded during all the numerous bourgeois revolutions which Europe has witnessed since the fall of feudalism. In particular, it is precisely the petty bourgeoisie that is attracted to the side of the big bourgeoisie and is largely subordinated to it through this apparatus, which provides the upper strata of the peasantry, small artisans, tradesmen and the like, with comparatively comfortable, quiet and respectable jobs, raising their holders above the people. Consider what happened in Russia during the 6 months following February 27, 1917. The official posts, which formerly were given by preference to members of the Black Hundreds, have now become the spoils of the cadets, Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. Nobody has really thought of introducing any serious reforms. Every effort has been made to put them off until the Constituent Assembly, and to steadily put off the Constituent Assembly until the end of the war. But there's been no delay, no waiting for the Constituent Assembly and the division of the spoils, in getting the lucrative jobs of ministers, vice ministers, governor generals, etc., etc. The game of combinations with regard to the composition of the government has been, in essence, only an expression of this division and redivision of the spoils, which has been going on high and low throughout the country in every department of central and local government. The 6 months between February the 27th and August the 27th, 1917 can be objectively summed up beyond all dispute as follows. Reforms shelved, distribution of official jobs accomplished, and mistakes in the distribution corrected by a few redistributions. But the more the bureaucratic apparatus is redistributed among the various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties, among the cadets, socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks in the case of Russia, the more clearly the oppressed classes and the proletariat at their head become conscious of their irreconcilable hostility to the whole of bourgeois society. That is why it becomes necessary for all bourgeois parties, even for the most democratic and revolutionary democratic among them, to intensify repressive measures against the revolutionary proletariat, to strengthen the apparatus of repression, i.e. that same state machine. This course of events compels the revolution to concentrate all its forces of destruction against the state power, and to set itself the task not of improving the state machine, but of demolishing and destroying it. It was not logical reasoning, but the actual development of events, the living experience of 1848 to 51 that led to the task being presented in this way. The extent to which Marx held strictly to the ground of actual historical experience can be seen from the fact that in 1852, he did not yet concretely raise the question of what was to take the place of the state machine that was to be destroyed. Experience had not yet provided material for the solution of this problem, which history placed on the order of the day later on, in 1871. In 1852, all that could be established with the accuracy of scientific observation was that the proletarian revolution had approached the task of concentrating all its forces of destruction against the state power, of smashing the state machine. Here the question may arise, is it correct to generalize the experience, observations and conclusions of Marx, to apply them to a field that is wider than the history of France during the 3 years 1848 to 51? Before proceeding to deal with this question, let us first recall a remark made by Engels and then examine the facts. In his preface to the 3rd edition of the 18th Brumaire, Engels wrote, "France is the land where more than anywhere else the historical class struggles were each time fought out to a decision, and where consequently the changing political forms within which they move and in which their results are summarized have been stamped in the sharpest outlines. The centre of feudalism in the Middle Ages, the model country of unified monarchy, resting on estates since the Renaissance. France demolished feudalism in the Great Revolution and established the unalloyed rule of the bourgeoisie in a classical purity unequalled by any other European land. And the struggle of the upward striving proletariat against the ruling bourgeoisie appeared here in an acute form unknown elsewhere." Page 4, 1907. The last sentence is out of date, inasmuch as since 1871 a lull has set in the revolutionary struggle of the French proletariat. Although long as this lull may be, it does not at all preclude the possibility that in the coming proletarian revolution, France may show herself to be the classic land of the class struggle to a finish. Let us, however, cast a general glance over the history of the advanced countries at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. We shall see that the same process has been going on more slowly, in more varied forms, in a much wider field. On the one hand, the development of parliamentary power, both in the republican countries, France, America, Switzerland, and in the monarchies, England, Germany to a certain extent, Italy, the Scandinavian countries, etc. On the other hand, The struggle for power among the various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties which distributed and redistributed the spoils of office, while the foundations of the bourgeois system remained unchanged, and finally, the perfection and consolidation of the executive power, its bureaucratic and military apparatus. There is not the slightest doubt that these features are common to the whole of the modern evolution of the capitalist states in general. In the 3 years 1848 to 51, France displayed in a swift, sharp, concentrated form the very same processes of development which are characteristic of the whole capitalist world. Imperialism, the era of bank capital, the era of gigantic capitalist monopolies, the era of the development of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism, has demonstrated with particular force an extraordinary strengthening of the state machine and an unprecedented growth of its bureaucratic and military apparatus, in connection with the intensification of repression against the proletariat, both in the monarchical and in the freest republican countries. World history is now undoubtedly leading, on an incomparably larger scale than in 1852, to the concentration of all the forces of the proletarian revolution on the destruction of the state machine. What the proletariat will put in its place is indicated by the extremely instructive material furnished by the Paris Commune. Part 3. The presentation of the question by Marx in 1852. In 1907, Meyring published in the Newsite, volume XXV 2, page 164, extracts from a letter by Marx to Weidemeyer, dated March 5, 1852. This letter contains, among other things, the following remarkable observation. And now, as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society, nor yet the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this struggle of the classes, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production, and two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and three, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes a transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. In these words, Marx succeeded in expressing with striking clarity, firstly, the chief and radical difference between his teaching and that of the foremost and most profound thinkers of the bourgeoisie, and secondly, the essence of his teaching on the state. It's often said and written that the main point in Marx's teachings is the class struggle, but this is not true. And from this untruth very often springs the opportunist distortion of Marxism, its falsification in a spirit that makes it acceptable to the bourgeoisie. For the doctrine of the class struggle was created not by Marx, but by the bourgeoisie before Marx, and generally speaking, it is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. He who recognizes only the class struggle is not yet a Marxist. It may turn out that he has not yet gone beyond the bounds of bourgeois thinking and bourgeois politics. To confine Marxism to the doctrine of the class struggle means curtailing Marxism, distorting it, reducing it to something acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Only he is a Marxist who extends the recognition of the class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is what constitutes the most profound difference between the Marxist and the ordinary petty as well as big bourgeois. This is the touchstone on which the real understanding and recognition of Marxism is to be tested. And it is not surprising that when the history of Europe brought the working class face to face with this question as a practical issue, not only all the opportunists and reformists, but all the Kortskyites, people who vacillate between reformism and Marxism, proved to be miserable Philistines and petty bourgeois Democrats who repudiate the dictatorship of the proletariat. Kautsky's pamphlet, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, published in August 1918, i.e. long after the first edition of the present book, is a perfect example of petty bourgeois distortion of Marxism and base renunciation of it in practice, while hypocritically recognizing it in words. See my pamphlet, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, Petrograd and Moscow, 1918. Present-day opportunism, in the person of its principal representative, the ex-Marxist K.E. Kautsky, fills in completely with Marx's characterization of the bourgeois position quoted above. For this opportunism limits the recognition of the class struggle to the sphere of bourgeois relations. Within this sphere, within its framework, not a single educated liberal will refuse to recognize the class struggle in principle. Opportunism does not extend the recognition of the class struggle precisely to what is most important to the period of transition from capitalism to communism, to the period of the overthrow and the complete abolition of the bourgeoisie. In reality, this period inevitably is a period of an unprecedentedly fierce class struggle in unprecedentedly acute forms, and consequently, during this period, the state must inevitably be a state that is democratic in a new way, for the proletariat and the propertieless in general, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. To proceed, the essence of Marx's teaching on the state has been mastered only by those who understand that the dictatorship of a single class is necessary not only for every class society in general, not only for the proletariat, which has overthrown the bourgeoisie, but also for the entire historical period which separates capitalism from classless society from communism. The forms of bourgeois states are extremely varied, but their essence is the same. All these states, whatever their form, in the final analysis, are inevitably the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The transition from capitalism to communism certainly cannot but yield a tremendous abundance and variety of political forms, but the essence will inevitably be the same: the dictatorship of the proletariat.